We're going to talk about screening now, and this is again further looking at kind of the early parts of the process of personnel psychology. So we've already kind of really been focusing in this class on selection techniques, ways to measure predictors versus outcomes, looking at the criterion problem of actual performance and how to measure performance, using job analyses to actually fuel these, and we're really kind of getting a little bit more into the overlap with HR when we're talking about recruitment and screening. And we're now moving on to screening. And screening basically is not the actual hiring process itself and often somewhat separate from selection decisions, but is specifically determining those early decisions on who's actually going to be looked at more in detail. So how do you screen a large number of applicants into a manageable number that will generate top candidates? So screening and selection happens during the very first stages of selection. This is the screening process, and generally the information being used for screening is coming from application blanks and reference checks. So the two biggest areas of data that we're gathering screening information from is the actual applications themselves. And those applications can include demographic information. They can be generated forced option choice forms that people fill out when they apply for the job. They can also include biographical information, including those that are collected through surveys and also sometimes through the resume itself. This also includes checking recommendations or reference checks. So basically reaching out to the references that were listed by the person applying to the job to make sure that they support the application or information that the applicant provided. Now, the screening process is subject to ethical and legal constraints as well as practical issues, and we're going to talk about each of those, but kind of from an ethical viewpoint, we do have to ask what kind of questions would be perceived as an invasion of privacy. What kind of questions might be actually perceived negatively by applicants that might then also influence the overall perception of the company, so the image of the company beyond the hiring process. There are legal constraints in what types of questions can be asked in a screening process. This is generated not only by EEOC and compliance rates for protected groups, but also, again, individual states and municipalities will have different legal constraints of what can and cannot be asked of an applicant, and also at what point. So, for instance, a screening question cannot ask about disability, but once an offer of hire has been made, then it is legal to discuss potential reasonable accommodations and whether those accommodations can be met for that person to work. Same with medical issues. It's usually illegal in most areas to ask someone about a medical condition as a part of an initial biographical screening process. However, again, if that medical condition would make it difficult or impossible for the person to do the job, once the offer is made, then that can become a condition of employment. And also there's practical issues that reference checks, though seen as a very positive way to gather additional screening information, how people actually react to being asked to give references provides some issues as far as how practically useful these techniques are. So recommendations and reference checks, the information that we're trying to gather at this phase falls into four categories. So we want employment and education history. So almost all attempts to create kind of an initial screening is going to look for a bare minimum of employment, and anyone that's been on the job market have probably seen examples of this. For example, 3+ years of experience in this type of work or previous experience with this type of company. That's asking you to provide what is your employment history that makes you a match for this job. And educational history. And again, a lot of jobs will say high school diploma required, bachelor's degree required, master's in a particular field required, or even PhD required. Next category is evaluation of the character, personality, and interpersonal skills. Now, these are going to generally be something that we're going to probably try to select for in more detail once we've screened the applicant pool. But the applicant pool and biodata can provide some information, especially with reference checks and also asking people about previous experiences to give some indication, which allows us to make some prediction on the person's personality or interpersonal skills. Again, a person that actually has a background in public speaking and working in groups, their employment history, we can infer probably has better interpersonal skills. Someone that has a work history that involves them working alone and outside of groups and has been generally working in small companies, that might also let us infer this person may have less developed interpersonal skills. The third category is evaluation of previous job performance. So we're hoping to gather how successful were they at those jobs. And this can again be gathered not necessarily by whether or not they work at the company or not, but for example, if someone had worked for 10 years at a company and had stayed at a particular level, so hired a manager in 1999, left the company in 2009, still a manager. That can kind of indicate, well, they may have done that job well, but they certainly didn't ever advance in the company, compared to someone with the same work history that had started as a manager, had moved up to director, and was leaving the company as a VP. Again, we can infer that person clearly was probably performing very well in those roles. Also, through reference checks, we can hopefully at least gather information of willingness to hire. And I was talking about the practicality of reference checks, and one example is the cartoon I have below. So, hi, I'm calling to check the references of your ex-employee named Ted. And the response, we have a company policy against giving references, but I'd be happy to discuss the weather with you. Okay. Right there, I'm going to stop the cartoon for a second. And a lot of companies actually have created basically zero tolerance policies towards references, that they either do not respond to reference checks at all, or if they do, they will simply respond with confirmation of hire and termination dates. In other words, yes, they worked here from this date to this date, and that's the only information we're allowed to give. In the cartoon, though, the person, of course, says, I'm willing to discuss the weather with you, and then says the clouds are moving lazily across the sky, and everyone thinks they're stupid. So the reason for this difficulty of getting information from reference checks has been civil lawsuits against organizations that have given negative recommendations. We'll talk about that in a little bit. Some organizations are willing to answer beyond just time of initial hire and time of termination or the person leaving, with also answering the question, would they be willing to rehire? So that's often a common question, simply just directly, did this person work for you? And if they were reapplying to the job, would you rehire them? So any criticism given in a reference check can lead to charges of libel for written evaluations or slander from oral evaluations. So the first problem we have with reference checks is the idea that companies are worried that if they actually allow their employees to give references, either verbal or written, that any information that individual that was hired that works for the company gives, if it can't be defended in a court of law with actual proof, the company itself can be held liable or held for slander for those comments. So that's where these policies of not giving references checks is often coming from. Also, research has found that when actually asking for reference checks and people are willing to give them, that the information they give often is more of an indicator of the company's culture and the actual person giving the reference check than the actual information about the person being referred to. So what this is telling us is that research has found there's more consistency when you're getting reference checks from people, when people are giving them, so they're willing to actually say yes or no and here's why, that the information that the person getting that reference makes as far as inferences about the person is less accurate than inferences they could make about the person giving the reference check. In other words, we learn more about the referee than the person they're referring. So do remember, reference checks are legal, reference checks are expected. However, the usefulness of reference checks is somewhat questionable, considering that a lot of organizations are going to have some form of policy of not really giving useful information with reference checks. However, it also is a legal issue if you don't use reference checks. So failure to check may lead to an organization being held liable if a future problem occurs. So if you have someone, for example, that is applying for a job, claims they've had previous experience, and then it turns out they were lying, if the company didn't check those references, at least find out if the person had been hired and how long they had worked for those organizations. In other words, confirming the information that was being provided was accurate. If there is a further problem with that actual employee, the company can actually be held responsible for not having done the reference checks. This especially occurs in industries where the people being hired are going to have direct contact with customers, especially if that contact might be in the customer's homes. and that person then ends up to not have the skill set or has a history of bad behaviors in previous companies that the company could have easily found out about with a reference check but didn't conduct them. So, reference checks. A lot of times the information we're going to get is going to be more about the person giving the check, or basically the person giving the reference, than the actual person they're referring. A lot of organizations are going to keep people by policy from giving any real information with a reference check. And both of these are driven by fear of legal ramifications from the person actually being referred. But also, there is a legal requirement for companies to pursue reference checks to at least say they made the attempt to gather this information. So another part of the screening process is personal history data, generally collected by either application blanks, weighted application blanks, biographical information blanks, but also just from the resume itself. We'll have a lot of this information. When you're creating an application blank, a weighted application blank, or a biographical information blank, and really the difference between these three terms is an application blank, more specifically, is simply just asking biographical and more often just work history information. So an application blank can specifically simply be list the last 4 places that you worked and for how long and what was your title. List your highest degree and where you got it from. So that's an application blank. A weighted application blank is simply a more standardized form that's asking similar questions, but has a built-in statistics behind it, if you will, that weights the applicant's responses. So sometimes these application blanks, for example, will not have open-ended questions. They'll have forced choice questions. So mark the highest degree that you have completed. And then the application blank automatically gives weight to those responses to come up with a numerical value for that applicant to allow screening. So a company, they may decide that you need 50 or more points off the weighted application blank for you to be actually looked at in more detail for the company hire. Biographical information blanks usually refer to an application blank that is more focused on actual history and more qualitative descriptions. So in other words, not just where did you work for the last 3 jobs and how long did you work there, but also describe your job and your roles for each of those. So that's gathering more biographical information. When creating these, an IO psychologist needs to worry about staying away from any items that may lead to adverse impact on protected groups. So basically, asking any question that might differentiate between various protected groups can result in an accusation of adverse impact. Now, if the question is job relevant, then again, that can be definitely defended, but you want to be very careful to think about the items that you're asking and could they result in a potential charge of adverse impact in your screening process. Stay away from any item that does not necessarily appear to be job related, and also avoid questions that may be an invasion of privacy. And this can be both a legal concern, asking questions that aren't allowed, such as another example is some areas you can ask if someone has been convicted of a crime, but you can't ask if someone's actually been arrested. Those are 2 different things. In some areas, you can't even ask about past criminal history at all. So there's legal concerns, but there's also the concern of would this question be considered an invasion of privacy, which will result in a negative reaction in your applicant pool. Be also aware that non-answers are viewed negatively. So when you're applying for a job, studies have found that when people choose to not respond to a biographical question or an application question, that non-response is usually viewed as negative, as if someone had went ahead and chosen a negative response. So for instance, if there's a question that says, have you ever been convicted of a felony? A non-response will often be viewed just as negatively as if someone actually admitted that they had been arrested for or convicted of a felony. So what can we learn from biodata in the selection process, specifically screening? So we can predict language and math ability from education items. So again, the question is whenever we're looking at any kind of screening application blank, whether it's a weighted blank, whether it's biographical information, or whether it's simply a review of resumes, we are wanting to still match items on that resume or items on that application blank to specific predictors of performance taken from a job analysis, hopefully, for that job. So it's not just a process of subjectively looking at resumes or blanks and looking for people that look good. It should be a fairly systematic process. For example, if an important part of the job is math abilities, then you can say we would predict people that have a past history with an undergraduate degree in math and or has worked in research and statistics to have better math skills than someone that hasn't. So we are going to predict for screening that those are things we want to see in the applicants we're going to look at in later. So in other words, we're going to predict language and math ability from educational items and possibly also previous work. Physical ability from sports and health. So if the job requires a fair amount of actual physical activity, again, we can be looking for, have they had jobs that would have required similar physical abilities to be used? Do they have a history in their, a lot of times resumes will have hobbies at the back. Do we see sports, running, lifting? Those can be indicators that this is someone that might be better suited for this job. Leadership and interpersonal abilities from previous experience, and I already kind of talked about this, the idea of actually looking at the types of job the person had, types of experience, have they had leadership roles before, and again, we can use this information to kind of predict future success in the organization. Sociability can be drawn from various activities or charities, openness from travel and educational experiences. So again, if we're looking for someone that's going to travel a lot, we can look at their resume, and if we see that their hometown, their job, and their college have all been in the same town, in other words, their high school was in St. Louis, their undergrad was in St. Louis, their graduate school was in St. Louis, and they're currently working in St. Louis, we can maybe make an inference this would not be the best applicant for a job that requires a lot of travel. However, if we saw someone who actually their high school or their high school degree was in Puerto Rico, their undergraduate degree was in Texas, their master's degree was in Missouri, and then their PhD had been gained in Illinois, and they're currently working in Indiana, that might be taken as an indication that this person might be more open to relocate or travel. And motivation levels from all their experiences. So again, asking, how motivated is this person, how driven is this person, based on their biodata. Another thing to consider with this information is response distortion in both application blanks and biographical data. And again, biographical data includes resumes. Research findings have found as many as 20 to 25% of resumes distort, sweeten, or inflate various pieces of information. And what this really refers to is not simply providing the best possible framing of an experience. We're talking about actually direct distortion. So if someone, for instance, worked as a data analyst, if they then claim they managed large databases when they never worked with databases, that would be an example of what we're talking about here. So again, trying to determine how many resumes or how accurate resumes or biodata is definitely an issue if we can find 20 to 25% of resumes are outright effectively lying. So some attempts have been made to make predictors of honesty, in other words, looking for values, morals, and religious faith, and all of these have been found to be related to the likelihood of someone lying. So the more someone considers values and morals an important part of who they are, the more someone considers their religiosity to be an important part of who they are, usually they're less likely to distort information on biographical data. So some organizations actually look for indications of this in the actual biodata to value that information a little bit more highly. In other words, we're assuming it's less likely to be distorted. There are other ways to control distortion. Request verifiable information. So basically, if your biographical, your application dates, blanks, and your biographical data requests are all focused on verifiable information. In other words, simply when did you start, when did you end, what level did you finish at. Those are things that can be easily checked on and are less likely to be distorted then. Generally, it's been found there's less distortion in option key items. So basically, when you have a choice, but you don't get to fill out qualitative information. So if you simply ask highest level of degree completed, high school, bachelor's, master's, PhD, you're more likely to get a truthful answer than if you have an open-ended blank asking for describe your educational experience. Well, that allows someone to possibly inflate or distort what their actual experiences were and maybe make a claim or infer that they have a better degree than they actually do. Warn users of a lie scale. So actually, research has found that both putting in lie scales into multiple application blank questions, in other words, we're testing to find out if you lie, and also putting a statement in that any job offer may be immediately terminated if it is found that information provided on the resume or the application blank is false. Also, asking applicants to elaborate on their answers is a part of the screening process. So, if this first initial phone interview, for instance, is actually focused on elaborating on the responses to their original biographical information of their resume, a lot of times those distortions will start to come out as they'll either A, not remember what they had claimed, or B, when asked or pressed, may not be able to provide adequate responses. A good example actually of this is if someone actually makes claim of computer programs that they know they currently don't know but think they might be able to learn if a job required it, then in the middle of an actual phone screening actually is asked specific questions about a computer program that they claim they knew of. And if they couldn't answer those questions, that would clearly indicate again that that had been a distorted response.